Welcome to the Something to Gnaw On podcast, a short parable-style devotional for the Christian with a short attention span, usually. Right now we're doing a crash course through the Old Testament, designed to give a basic understanding of how it's laid out and hopefully pique your curiosity enough to take the initiative to gnaw on Scripture yourself, without being intimidated, of course, by such a big book. And if you're a seasoned student of the Bible, just look at this as a refresher course, and hopefully you'll begin to dig deeper into the Word. This episode is part 4 in the series, and we're covering Chronicles and Ezra. The following story is my personal reflections from a book called Counting Coup. It's an autobiography of a Crow warrior chief. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the Crow scouts advised against engaging the Sioux, highlighting the fact that the Sioux had more warriors than the U.S. cavalry had bullets, not to mention the facts that the U.S. cavalry had been riding all night and the Sioux had been rested in the valley below, and Custer had lost the element of surprise when he'd been spotted by Sioux scouts. Custer rejected their counsel and dismissed the 6 scouts when they shed their scout uniforms and donned their warrior garb. They were certain they were going to die. Better to die a warrior than a soldier. Custer paid for this decision with his life and the life of the men under his command. And the scouts, well, they lived to tell the story. They were the last of the Crow warrior chiefs, except for Joe. Joe was a step-grandson of White Man Runs Him, one of the 6 scouts with Custer at the Little Bighorn, and he grew up in the sunset years of the warrior chiefs, listening to their first-hand accounts of valor. While Joe was secretly being trained in the warrior tradition, the philosophy of Chief Plentycoo emphasized the use of a new weapon, education. Quote, "Education is your most powerful weapon. With education, you are the white man's equal. Without education, you are his victim, and so shall remain all your lives." End quote. Joe would begin his education by getting his associate's degree from Bacone College in Muskogee, Oklahoma. Next, he earned his bachelor's degree from Linfield College in McMinnville, Oregon. Joe would then proceed to the University of Southern California, where he earned his master's degree in anthropology, the first of the Crow to earn such a degree. His master's thesis from the 1930s is used to this day as an authoritative account of Crow history. This academic momentum carried on to a doctoral program where Joe completed his coursework, but due to World War II, did not complete his dissertation. In 1943, Joe enlisted and became a scout for the Army's 103rd Infantry Division and, in keeping with warrior tradition, Private Joe Medicine Crow went into battle with red war paint under his uniform and a yellow feather under his helmet, holding firmly to his heritage. World War II is not exactly the forum for a Crow to earn the 4 coups, especially as a private. Besides, Medicine Crow didn't seem to have an eye on such accolades. Staying alive is more than half the battle. That said, at a battle on the Siegfried Line, Joe would get an opportunity to lead a group of 7 men on a suicide mission. His commanding officer commented, "If anyone can do it, it's probably you, Joe." An American position had been bombarded and abandoned, leaving significant amounts of dynamite behind. Private Medicine Crow and 7 others dodged bullets to cross the snow-covered field, secured the dynamite, and proceeded to move it toward the wall. They successfully blew a hole in the wall large enough for the infantry to pass through. Some have suggested that Medicine Crow was the first to enter Germany. Although it would be given years later, Joe earned the Bronze Star for his act of heroism. Upon his return to the Crow Reservation, the elders would point out that this fulfilled one of the coups, leading a successful raiding party. The exploits would continue. As the 103rd worked their way through the wall and through the town, Joe got separated from his unit. Rounding a corner at a brisk pace, he collides with a German soldier. They both hit the ground. The German soldier lost his gun. Joe did not. While Joe had his rifle trained on the soldier, he wouldn't pull the trigger. It didn't seem fair to shoot an unarmed man. So Private Medicine Crow put his rifle down and started into a scrapping match with the German. The fight went back and forth some, but after nearly being pinned, Joe reached out and grabbed the German by the throat with a crow-like death grip. Nearing death, the German managed to scream out the words, "Mama." Joe relented, confiscated his weapon, and took the soldier captive. In the moment, it was survival, but on the arrival back at the Crow Reservation, the elders would point out that Medicine Crow had fulfilled 2 of the coups, touching your enemy and letting him live, and taking your enemy's weapon. It's quite impressive to accomplish 3 coups, but who has horses in World War II to cover the 4th coup? Well, on a recon mission deep in German territory, Joe and his scouts discovered a farmhouse where a large group of German officers were meeting. The corral held their horses, 50 fine thoroughbreds. Armed with a 1911 sidearm and a rope, Medicine Crow sneaked past the German guards, tied a makeshift bridle, picked a horse for himself, and stampeded the other 49 with a warrior cry. As he rode off, he sang a Crow song, accentuated with gunfire from the German officers, most of whom were standing in front of the farmhouse in their underwear, lobbing 9mm bullets. What kind of panic went through their mind when they heard that Crow warrior cry in the middle of their REM cycle? This 4th coup wasn't just achieved, it was obliterated. 50 of the enemy's horses. What an accomplishment. Upon his return to the reservation, the elders would assess the exploits and make Joe what would be known as the last warrior chief. In the years that followed the war, Medicine Crow would serve in several capacities for the tribe, including tribal historian. 3 colleges would confer honorary doctorates upon him, and he would eventually be awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Joe grew up in this legacy. He spent his early years at the feet of the warrior chiefs, learning the warrior tradition. He pursued higher education like no Crow had before. He represented his country and his tribe with honor, respect, and many coups. He spent the post-war years of his life educating people, especially his people, and serving as a tribal historian, amongst other duties for the tribe. He didn't just learn the legacy, he lived the legacy. And in living the legacy, he left the legacy for the next generation of Crow. Legacy, that characteristic or quality that weaves through history and keeps us anchored. For some, it's a characteristic of faith or service or occupation or generosity or familial or cultural pattern, and I could go on this issue, but you get the point. This idea of legacy or holding on to the history or your bloodline is at the center of Medicine Crow's life, and at the same time, it is seen at the center of the works of a priest named Ezra, about 450 BC. In today's episode, we're going to look at the books of Chronicles and Ezra, both of which are written by Ezra. Remember at the end of Kings, God had finally executed judgment against the Israelites, and some died, and some remained unprotected and overrun in Jerusalem, and a contingent was carried off to a 70-year timeout in Babylon. As much as the exiles complained about their situation, they experienced the best situation that this time frame had to offer. Life in Babylon is better than death and better than living in a defenseless Jerusalem, being constantly harassed by surrounding people groups. Now, with all that said, it's after this 70-year timeout is up that Ezra writes Chronicles. You might say that Ezra is writing a crash course through history because the book starts with a genealogy that connects the exiles in Babylon with Adam and the patriarchs and David, and a special amount of time is devoted to the Levites, which leads many to say that while the Jews in Babylon were the general audience, there's a specific focus in both of these books that are geared towards priests and Levites. And if you're wondering, a Levite is from the tribe of Levi, one of the 12 tribes, which is where the priestly line comes from. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam were Levites. And you can see this focus in tribal legacy in that he focuses 3 chapters, or nearly 100 verses, on the tribe of Judah, which would be the bloodline of King David, from whose line the Messiah comes. He has 1 chapter to the Levites that totals 81 verses long. And the genealogy of the other 10 tribes are jammed into 4 short chapters. When we covered the book of Kings, I made the observation that there was not only a king that ruled over Israel, but there was also a check and a balance in place and that check and balance was the priest or the prophet. Ezra's work in capturing this history solidifies this. As a matter of perspective, if a person was 30 years old when they went into exile, they were probably dead or close to it at the time of the end of the exile. If a person was 20 years of age at exile, they would be 90. I often question if these people actually made the trip back to Jerusalem. I will not belabor this point, but you can see that much of Ezra's audience would be largely unfamiliar with life in Jerusalem, the temple, the altar, and potentially out of touch with their heritage or legacy. And in the same way we looked at the sin cycles in Judges, Ezra not only uses the genealogies in Chronicles to connect them to their past, he tells the story of the kings, all the kings, beginning with Saul, highlighting their behavior, both good and bad, right up to the time of the exile. Reading the books of Chronicles so far after the fact, it seems a bit laborious and insignificant to dig into some of the genealogies. It's tempting to read them as insignificance or completely passing by. But nothing could be further from the truth. There are some golden nuggets to be found here. But the bigger question would be, what would the Jews in exile have thought of these genealogies? I don't know that I can say it with absolute certainty, but it certainly seems that this would reestablish or reinforce Jewish legacy. In the same way that a child like Medicine Crow sitting at the feet of the war chiefs would connect with his heritage. And in the same way that Medicine Crow turned his educational experience as a youth into his master's thesis that is used to this day as a means of connecting the Crow to their historical legacy, that is what Ezra is doing in Chronicles. This dynamic of reestablishing and reinforcing legacy will flow into the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But as I round out Chronicles, let me just add a couple of trinkets with regard to Bible study in general. First, the account of the actual kings are great secondary sources for what you read about in Samuel and Kings. These books have the same relationship to each other that the Gospels have to each other. They are covering the exact same topic, but from a different perspective. And Ezra's perspective is from that of a priest. And it is written to a group of people getting ready to reoccupy the Promised Land and reestablish the worship of Jehovah in Jerusalem. As an example of this, I recently caught a sermon online that my little brother did regarding worship. And I'll resist the urge to launch a bunch of stories about my brother because that'd get really fun in a not-so-fun way. But his sermon was regarding worship, and he highlighted a story that is covered in Samuel and in Chronicles, where David is bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and a guy named Uzzah touches it, dies, and the party's over. Great story. You can dig into it for yourself, and I'll post a link to the sermon so you can see how the telling of the same story from Ezra's point of view being communicated to a people who may not have had any experience with the holiness of God and the seriousness of walking in his ways. Ezra, from his priestly point of view, points out some details in the episode that Samuel doesn't expand upon, details that are important for Ezra's audience, an exiled audience that will soon be reintroducing the Ark and temple furnishings in Jerusalem. My guess is that he probably doesn't want another Uzzah incident on their 900-mile journey from Babylon. And these kind of stories will parallel those both in Samuel and Kings. I would encourage you that when you read these stories in Samuel and Kings, see if there isn't an account in Chronicles. Reading it this way just brings a bit more clarity and plenty of depth to the stories. And lastly, before we jump into the book titled Ezra, I've mentioned before that there are times when you read stories in Scripture and between sentences you have major gaps in time. There's 400 years between Genesis and Exodus. And in 2 Chronicles 36, between verses 21 and 22, you have a gap of 70 years, the period of the exile. And what's interesting about this is that the book of Ezra begins by restating the last verse in Chronicles. Okay, guys, this is a great place to take a break if you need to. Press pause and come back later, or just power on through. I'll just make a quick note here. I am still working feverishly behind the scenes to get the store up and running. We just had a couple of graphic design and / printing deals there. Anyhow, long story short is I want them to be right and I want them to be good. And in my excitement, I thought this store would be open a little bit sooner, but we're going to be looking at maybe another week here. So appreciate your patience, appreciate your support. Stay tuned. Check out the Facebook page, and that'd be probably the best place to get up-to-date information on that. But anyhow, let's get back to the story. I love the book of Ezra, love what's going on here. Wish we could get into it deeper, but let's at least get this crash course knocked out and give you a baseline for you to go back and read it yourself. Now let's get into Ezra. So far in this series, I have tried to keep the historical books in a section all its own. But we have a situation here that causes us to take a quick look at a couple of prophets from the 4th section of the Old Testament, the major prophets. In the weeks to come, we will take a quick look at where the prophets fit in the timeline of Kings and Chronicles. In fact, with the exception of Daniel, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, all of the prophets serve in the time of the kings, up to the first years of the exile. And what they prophesy is written to the Israelites in those periods of time, and understanding the circumstances and the reign of each king helps to understand the prophecy. And we'll get into that deeper another time. Today, however, let's go back to 2 Chronicles 36, verse 21, which provide a validation of prophecy, and then Ezra 1:1, which provides another validation of prophecy from years prior. Quote, "So the message of the Lord spoke through Jeremiah was fulfilled. The land finally enjoyed its Sabbath rest, lying desolate until the 70 years were complete, just as the prophet had said." It's verse 21. Now Ezra 1:1, quote, "In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord fulfilled the prophecy that he had given through Jeremiah. He stirred the heart of Cyrus to put this proclamation in writing and to send it throughout the kingdom. And that message is to let the Israelites return to Jerusalem and build the temple." And verse 5 is also key to understanding the whole book. Quote, "Then God stirred the hearts of the priests and the Levites and the leaders of Judah and Benjamin to go to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple of the Lord." End quote. Remember what we had previously mentioned about their tribal legacy. Judah, representing the royal line, responsible for funding the building of the original temple, they have a legitimate interest and legacy in the rebuilding of the temple. And the Levites have a tribal legacy and a responsibility as well for reestablishing and leading the nation in proper worship within the temple. It's no wonder that he spent so much time in Chronicles with genealogy of Levites and descendants of Judah. I honestly wonder if the other tribes got comfortable in Babylon, as it doesn't appear that many of them left in the first wave. Just thinking out loud, but anyhow. One of these passages reinforces the prophetic accuracy of Jeremiah's word in Jeremiah 25 and confirmed again in Jeremiah 29. And the span of time between Nebuchadnezzar and the fall of Jerusalem to Cyrus is 70 years. It's pretty cool in my opinion. Of additional interest, this reference to Cyrus, king of Persia, is worthy of conversation. Not only did God say that the exile would be 70 years, and it was, but God spoke through Jeremiah in chapter 51, verses 20, that the one who would bring the deliverance from Babylon would be Cyrus of Persia, and his name was written down many years prior to his existence. And if that isn't cool enough for you, around 150 years previous to that, God speaks through Isaiah. You can see that in Isaiah chapter 45 and 48, to prophetically state that not only would they be delivered from Babylonian captors by a Persian they didn't even know existed that time, but his name would be Cyrus. I'm not sure what the statistical probability of someone guessing the name of a president years from now, but I think it's better to call it a divine prophecy as opposed to a lucky guess. In his book, Ezra will maintain the importance of their heritage, but he begins the book with a stark call to action. that they are living in a prophetic time where two revered prophets from two eras would name their deliverer. And not only are they delivered, Cyrus says in short, you are free to go. Take anyone with you. Rebuild the temple. I'll finance it, and we're giving you back all that was taken from you. I see Ezra in a place of divine tension. It's like graduation. For years he's sat at the feet of the elders, listening to the stories from the past, taking their teachings, reading the prophecies of Jeremiah and others. And now the reality is setting in that they will be going back. There's excitement in the dream becoming a reality, and there's a reasonable degree of apprehension, the concern that they will repeat the cycle so common in Jewish history. Where 1st and 2nd Chronicles are written to say, this is your heritage, learn from it, replicate the good, run from the evil. Ezra, and Nehemiah for that matter, are written as more of a, now it's your time, now it's your turn. This is your moment. It's time to step up to the plate. Now it's your time to take what you've learned and apply it. It isn't a moment in time. It is the moment that a couple of 100 years of prophecy have pointed to, a moment that will forever be looked at through history as a benchmark of time. And in true Ezra fashion, the book starts again with a list. Lists of items, list of names, categories of people, numbers of animals, the kinds of animals. And the building of the altar and the temple begin pretty quick. And in practical outline form, there are a few key elements to understand the flow of the book of Ezra. After these lists, the exiles come back in 3 waves. The initial wave under a guy named Zerubbabel, and we haven't talked about him yet, but he is the first to lead a group. The second wave comes under Ezra in chapter 7. Yeah, he doesn't make it there until chapter 7, although he writes about it. The third wave comes under Nehemiah, and we'll get into him next week. As I've stated before, Ezra is a priest, and after his lists of who's who and what's what, the first acts recorded are the beginning of sacrifices on the altar, which begin to happen on a daily basis. And immediately following that, worship begins, and the building of the temple begins. And immediately there's opposition. Any guesses who that group of people is? You guessed it, the Samaritans. They come in and they want to be a part of the building party using the phrase, we worship the same God that you worship. And you can find this in Ezra 4. And you can catch up on the significance of this in a previous episode. And at first glance, it looks like the Israelites are totally overreacting by the way they slam the door in the Samaritan's face. But you have to keep in mind that these guys just came out of 70 years of exile for not honoring God properly, and are living in a historic moment. And the question, assuming they've read Ezra's work on Chronicles, is, how are you going to interact with other people in the land? Are you going to keep God number one? Or are you going to get soft? Or are you going to keep the law? They understand the consequence of going against God's ways. This group isn't messing around, and they slam the door. And while the Jews pass the first test, it infuriates this people group, and a conflict and opposition begins. Accusations are sent to Cyrus, and then to Darius, and then to Artaxerxes. It stretches the completion of the temple out about 25 years from the initial return from the first wave. About 45 years after the completion of the temple, we have the second wave returning from Babylon, and this is found in chapter 7. And I want to take a moment here to just run the numbers with you. The 70-year exile is over, and if you're in Babylon, you can leave. That's about 536 BC. The first wave left and built the altar and the temple in the first 25 years. The second wave doesn't leave Babylon under Ezra till almost 90 years later, 457 BC. So, Nate, what's your point here? There's no way that Ezra had any first-hand knowledge of life in Jerusalem. Everything that he writes about would come from his familial priestly legacy or heritage. from sitting at the feet of his elders, soaking up the stories and teachings that flowed through a priestly line, like Joe Medicine Crow did as a kid. And according to chapter 7, Ezra comes from quite a line of priests, much like Medicine Crow came from a great line of chiefs. Ezra came from such a noteworthy line that Artaxerxes gives him quite a send-off letter and entrusts him with money and authority. So as he writes Chronicles up through chapter 6 of Ezra, it's from a perspective of educational heritage and history. That is to say, it's academic. Kind of like that Joe Medicine Crow scenario sitting at the feet of the warrior chiefs. When we get to chapter 7, Ezra is beginning to live the legacy. Think back to Medicine Crow's story. It's the same thing. At some point, the learning ends, the studying ends, and the opportunity is presented to step up and see if you have what it takes to sustain the legacy. Medicine Crow went to Germany to solidify the legacy. And Ezra, he'll do the same, but in Israel. For the sake of time, I'll abbreviate his ministry in the last 4 chapters, and that is to say that he gets to Jerusalem and leads a revival. The Israelites, in the 90 years after the first wave had left Babylon, had managed to drift, and Ezra was the man for the job. And he gets them back on track. And I need to leave enough here for you to read it on your own. But for the Israelites to need a revival, you need to know that their drifting included some pretty bad stuff. Bad enough for Ezra to do 2 things. In agony and lament, he tears his clothes and rips his beard out before the Lord. And in true Ezra form, he puts the names of the culprits on another list. I'm sure he'd be an accountant or an inventory clerk if he were alive today. In addition to being a priest, of course. One key I want you to walk away with today is that when it comes to legacy and heritage, especially your spiritual legacy or heritage, be like an Ezra or a Medicine Crow. Hold it high and pass it on. Don't let it die with you. I'm going to put a stake in it for today and pick it up next week with the transition into Nehemiah and hopefully Esther. There's some really cool stuff there. Anyhow, I pray that you will take the time to dig into this deeper for yourself and spend some time gnawing on this scripture mentally. Lastly, I want to take a moment and thank a family friend and a man I think of as a brother. Dean Buffalo is a Crow Indian and a pastor on the Flathead Indian Reservation. When I first heard of Joe Medicine Crow, I had the honor of talking with Dean about it, and he pointed me in the direction of the book. This has been years ago, and I'm just now working this into the podcast, and it's long overdue. That phone call with Dean was truly epic. You're blessed if you ever get those moments to connect with someone that way. And the term brother may sound a bit odd for as short as the call was in the light of eternity, but it was powerful. And I say thanks, brother. May God richly bless you and your family and the ministry on the Flathead Reservation. Until next week, God bless.